Marsha P. Johnson, Sylvia Rivera, Barbara Giddings, Dr. John Fryer. These are only a few names of people who are part of our LGBTQIA+ history. With a decline in LGBTQIA+ education, specifically in terms of historic events, it is so important for us as queer people to preserve and tell the stories of our LGBTQ+ elders. Today on QT, a history lesson. Stay with us. Welcome to QT, Queer Temple, the show in which we explore the world through the lens of LGBTQIA+ individuals. My name is Andreas, and today we want to talk about our elders and their legacy. Who threw the first heel at Stonewall, or was it a brick? For many years, the story of the 1969 Stonewall riots has been told from a very wide angle. Only in recent years, accounts of trans women of color finally came through. "Darlin', I want my gay rights now," is what young Marsha P. Johnson told the news reporters bravely as she was protesting for her sisters, brothers, and siblings. Our reporter, Adeja Wright, has led a discussion about the history of Marsha P. Johnson. Take a look.
Which is why I took this initiative to hopefully get to teach you guys a little bit more about her, because her story is very interesting. I actually did not know about Marsha at all until maybe a year or two ago. There's actually this film on Netflix called The Death and Life of Marsha P. Johnson, which I highly recommend you watch if you haven't already. It shocked me to know that this person who was so influential in this community is just not really talked about at all, especially in formal education. She was often dubbed as the Rosa Parks of the LGBTQ movement. Yeah, so let's just get started with her. So, like you guys said, you guys kind of know the bits and pieces. You guys want to kind of elaborate on what you guys do know, even if it is something very small.
I don't know if I could tell you where she was from, but I know that she was very involved with the Stonewall riots, and that whole movement, that she was kind of not necessarily the only leader, but one of the most prominent figures at that time for that.
Yeah, so I'm assuming both of you know about the Stonewall riots.
Yeah, for sure.
So yeah, that's kind of the main thing that she is known for, is for sort of being the main instigator of the Stonewall riot. However, that is not the only thing she has done during her time while she was still with us, because unfortunately she did pass away in, I believe, 1995. She not only was a part of the gay liberation movement, she actually co-founded a gay liberation movement. She was also the co-founder of STAR alongside her best friend Sylvia Rivera, who is another Latinx transgender woman. And they founded together the STAR Coalition, which is basically this home that was based in New York City that housed transgender youth that were homeless or at risk of being homeless. She was a drag queen, and she often toured with several other people doing different drag shows across America and Europe. She was well known. She was very well known. She was very locally famous in New York City for her drag. She was known in other parts of the world, in Europe, by people because of her drag shows. That was mainly what she was famous for in the beginning of her career, was her drag. She didn't really get more into her activism until later on in her life, but that was kind of the first part of just who she was. She was born initially actually in New Jersey, but left for New York City at age 17 after just not feeling as if her community was accepting of her or what she wanted to do. She went by Malcolm, which was her birth name up until she moved to New York City, where she then started to go by the name Marsha. And while she was there, she only came to New York City with only like $15 and a bag of clothes. And she waited tables at a restaurant in Greenwich Village to support herself. But after she came to New York, she really started to find her community within doing different sex work, doing things with the drag, which at that time was very underground. It wasn't something very performative or mainstream, I guess, as you could say. It was definitely something that was shunned and not something that was very acceptable at the time. This is around the 60s that all this was going on. So at this time, it was still illegal to be a gay person in America. And when she founded Star initially with her friend Sylvia Rivera, it was both co-owned by them, and it was ran primarily through their sex work and through their activism. And then, so that kind of continued for a while. And Marsha, she actually unintentionally got involved. Believe it or not, Stonewall Riot was a complete accident, really. It really was not something that was planned. The police had planned a raid on the Stonewall Inn. However, the patrons at the time, they weren't like, okay, here's the plan. We're gonna set this place on fire. Like, it really just happened out of pure anger and out of just wanting to end it. Stonewall was a very big target for the police. They knew that this was sort of a gay bar that a lot of LGBTQ people frequented, and they wanted to try their best to get this bar shut down. They were like, we cannot have this going, we cannot have this running anymore. That wasn't the first sort of raid that had happened, but this was the first time where everyone involved was just like, we have had enough. Marsha P. Johnson was there during the time of the riots, and she was said to sort of have been the first person to initiate it. And that was the beginning of the Stonewall riots. And no one at the time knew that that was going to be something that was going to lead up to even bigger protests. You think that riot just happened that day, and then it was just kind of like, okay, we did it. But the day after that, and then the day after that, protests, not even just in New York City, but all across major cities in America, like LA, San Francisco, I believe Chicago kind of did a thing. It set off almost like this domino effect. And it was because of Marsha, and because she was standing there on the front lines with everyone else, protesting and pushing, that we have the opportunities that we have today. And a lot of people credit her for things like, the Pride Parade and having Pride Month was all due to her and people like her who at the time were just dedicating their lives to fighting for gay liberation and gay rights. So with that being said, of course, Marsha was not the only one who was doing these things. But when you think about just her as a person and all that she did for the community, why is it, do you think, that she is not talked about enough?
I mean, I think a lot of it is for sure that she is or was, a Black trans woman, and that is not an image that we have projected to the public. It's been a lot of like flamboyant white gay men who kind of lead the public facing part of the movement, whereas like in reality, it was these people who had in a sense less to lose that really led the movement, but were less like seen as less palatable to the rest of the world.
I think additionally, part of it can just be attributed to like we just don't learn queer history. Like you don't really learn anything about it unless you actively go and seek it out. It's not something that's just taught in schools. Like, I don't think I heard anything about Stonewall or anything about any LGBTQ movement in a history class ever. So I think that the complete absence of queer history from our education is a huge contributor as to why we don't really know a lot about like Marsha P. Johnson. Like, we as a general populace, like we don't you have to search out that information yourself, and not everybody even knows that it's information that they should be searching out.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with both of you. It did have a huge part, or her identity it did have a huge part as to why she was not given the recognition that she absolutely deserved. Being that she was Black and she was transgender, actually during this time, being transgender, it was still something that even people within the LGBTQ community didn't exactly accept quite yet. There was discrimination between, gay people and lesbian women and transgender folks who just felt like, here we're here, but we're not exactly here for you guys yet. And it took a lot of fighting and just convincing that trans lives are human lives, and they deserve to be respected and have their rights preserved and protected. Similar to Marsha P. Johnson, Sylvia Rivera, she was also a transgender woman who what kind of fought alongside Marsha P. Johnson for for their rights. However, the thing with Sylvia is that she was very outspoken against the transphobia within the LGBTQ community, just talking about how she had been beaten, she had been arrested, she had been harassed and all these things for gay liberation. But the same people who she was trying to also fight for was the same people who were booing her on that stage. And it was just kind of like, I'm sitting here or I'm standing here fighting along with you guys, but you guys aren't helping us. So that is another thing that I feel like is a huge reason as to why we don't learn about her. And just in general, like I said, Marsha, she's no longer with us, and she passed away, I believe, at like age 47. She would have been well into her years at this point if she was alive. And I think similar to Marsha, there's several other LGBTQ elders who are still alive today. However, we don't give them enough credit, or we don't highlight their stories enough within modern day LGBTQ discussions. So, as a community, what do you think we can do to ensure that their stories are heard, their concerns are heard, and to make sure that moving forward, these are not people that history will forget about?
I think the biggest step is just to have more like cross-generational interaction. Like, I think it's important to have young queer people get to meet and get to learn the stories of like older queer people firsthand, because the older generations fought very hard for us to be where we are right now. I'm not going to act like everything is perfect for queer people right now, because it's not, but it is astronomically better than what it was, especially during like Marsha P. Johnson's time.
For that, and like even just what we're doing here right now and talking about it in a space where like other people will see it, is such a way of like telling people that there are people like 60s, 70s, 80s who have been queer, like who have lived as queer since like their teenage years, where we're at now. And just breaking down that narrative of like there are no elders, like if you're gay, you like get AIDS and die, because that's still very much like a narrative that gets pushed. Breaking down that barrier, like meeting these people and talking to them and telling their stories, and especially like um bringing forward those stories of just like queer joy, that like you can live your life this way and be happy and healthy, and see your life through, really.
I agree with both of you completely. And moving forward, I do hope that these conversations do continue and that more and more people do find out about Marsha, and not only just Marsha, but just people in general who fought for the rights of LGBTQ individuals and are the prime reason that's why we are here today. Not even just nationally known people, talking about people more on a locally known level also, and inviting them into the conversation and talking about their impacts within their own local communities, I think is just as important as recognizing larger figures such as Marsha P. Johnson, Sylvia Rivera, Josephine Baker, all those bigger, larger known people. I think talking about the smaller individuals made maybe considerably smaller acts in their own communities, I think are just as equally as important. So with that being said, Marsha P. Johnson, she did pass away, and her death was ruled as a suicide. However, a lot of people do believe that she was murdered, and as of 2012, her case has been reopened. We're not exactly too sure whether or not new information has been found or anything like that. But as of right now, her death has been ruled as a suicide. Um, Unfortunately, Sylvia has also passed away. And this is also another thing that I feel like is really important. These are people who were born in like the 30s and the 40s. They're getting old, okay? We do not have much time left with these people. And I feel like past generations kind of took a lot of that for granted, not even with LGBTQ people, but people from other historical events who were like first eyewitness people who can give first witness accounts to these events. We don't really take enough advantage of that. And I think that is super, 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 super important. If Marsha was still alive, I would have so many questions. I would probably have like a book of just like questions for her, like, how did this happen? Or what did you do with this? And it's just really interesting. So I'm hoping that moving forward, we can just engage in more conversations with more LGBTQ elders and just get to understand their perspective and their stories and their experiences, because they are valued and they are treasured and they absolutely need to be heard. So with that being said, please watch The Death and Life of Martha P. Johnson on Netflix. It is a very good film. I'm pretty sure there are other films based on her as well, but that was the one that I initially saw and got me into her story as a whole. So I would highly recommend you guys watch it. And yeah, thank you for joining this conversation. It was really enlightening to hear what you
Thank
guys had to
you.
say. Yeah, totally.
For sure.
History is important and needs to be preserved. And what better way to learn about preserving history than from the curator of the John J. Wilcox Jr. Archives at the William Way Center here in Philadelphia. Bob Sikba is exactly that person, and we sat down for a conversation about how and where to experience history here in the city of brotherly love and sisterly affection. Check it out. That's good. Well, welcome, Bob, to QT. Would you please first introduce yourself with your name, your pronouns, and your profession?
Sure, Andreas. I'm Bob Sikba, he, him, his, and I am the curator of collections at the LGBT Archives at the William Way Center. I'm a historian, I'm a writer, and I also work as a tour guide here in Philadelphia.
I saw that. That's pretty impressive and pretty cool. How did you find your way, and when did you find your way to Philadelphia?
I was living in Minneapolis in Minnesota, where it is damn cold, let me tell you. But I lived there for about 8 years with a boyfriend who we ran an opera company there. So a friend of ours, who's a soprano from here in Philadelphia, said, I have a house for rent outside of Philadelphia. Why don't you move there? And sight unseen, this was 1998 or 99. We packed up. I had only been to Philadelphia once in my life in the 80s. Within 6 months of moving here, my boyfriend and I broke up. He moved to New York and I stayed here, and I've been here ever since.
Wow. And Philadelphia is lucky to have you. You were literally, I would say, history of Philadelphia, specifically because you run the archive at the William Way Center. Why do you think it is so important to preserve LGBTQ plus history, specifically history of marginalized communities?
Yeah, to clarify, I don't run the archives, but I work there. We do have a trained archivist, John Andreas, my colleague, who technically runs the archive. I think when I started volunteering there, I realized what an important place Philadelphia had in America's LGBT history. I worked on an LGBT history project in 1979 and 1980 in Boston. So I was interviewing people in their 70s and 80s who were telling me about their lives in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. And I think what they told me just absolutely blew me away and impressed me so much, and I connected with it so much that I'm still doing that today. I mean, what I heard from them were real stories of courage, of being queer, of being different in a time in America when it was absolutely not only not welcome, but often dangerous. So they had to compartmentalize their lives into the gay part and the straight part. But I think from years of doing LGBT history, what I've learned was most important thing that queer people did was to not do what most people wanted them to do, which was to shut up and go away. So they found their voice and they spoke out and they continue to speak out. It's important for me as an archivist, as a curator, to not only preserve those voices from the past, but to tell them, to amplify them. I think it's vitally important, especially for young people, to know that they have many shoulders to stand on. They've had many ancestors before who've done so much work to bring them where they are today, and they should embrace that, and they should take advantage of that. So that's why I think that LGBTQ history is important.
Okay. And you were talking about the importance of specifically younger people knowing about LGBTQ history. What can we as younger people do to support our LGBTQ elders?
First of all, simply acknowledging them and talking to them is the primary way. I think that as queer people age, they tend to feel invisible and they tend to lose a connection to community. I feel so lucky to be working at the William Way Center, where I feel useful in the community and I feel connected to the community, where I meet people every day who are different, come from different places than I do. Uh, our director, Chris Bartlett, says, you never learn anything new by only associating with people who are like you. So it's so important for seniors to stay connected to community, to continually learn and grow.
Can you talk a little bit maybe about the specific events that you are hosting where old meets young?
I'm working on a right at the moment. I'm part of a new project called Queer Spaces Philadelphia. I do an LGBT mapping project where I map like over 1,000 places in Philadelphia. So as part of this new project called Queer Spaces, which is examining the way that queer people use geographical spaces, not only in cities, but out in the countryside too, how they manage to take places and make them their own when it's a difficult thing to do. Uh, Based on my mapping project, and the podcast will be called Mapping Out Loud. And the second or third episode, which we are just arranging, is going to be a dialogue between kids at the Attic Youth Center and seniors from the John C. Anderson apartment. So I'm in the middle of working on that right now. So that's a really germane question and a really, personally interesting question for me right now.
And if viewers are interested now in specifically this project, if they want to follow you and see when you drop that episode, where can they find you?
That's a good question. They should right now Google Queer Spaces Philadelphia. We do have a new website, but the project just began a few months ago, so it's really in its infancy right now.
Okay, nice. When we talk about history, specifically our history as the LGBTQ plus community, sometimes or most of the times it's really difficult stories that we are talking about, but they're also very positive LGBTQ history stories.
There have been several. There've definitely been more than one. But I had to think about the most recent one, which was 2015, certainly marriage equality, because I remembered that day so clearly. I was in the middle of curating an exhibit and it was hugely successful. And then this happened, and there I was out in the front lawn of the National Constitution Center, just yelling my fool head off when this happened. And it's one step, and I know it doesn't include all the community, but it's such it has such widespread effect. It was a natural change, and it ensured legal protections for people, which is such a big step in America. and LGBTQ rights.
Would you say you have a personal hero in history?
You mentioned her right away. I mean, I'm so happy I got to meet Barbara Giddings right away. Of all the people I've researched, and I've researched many, and there are many still around, LGBT activists can be difficult to deal with. Sometimes they're really egotistical, sometimes they're really pushy and bossy, which is fine. Pushy people get stuff done, and I appreciate that. I really do. Barbara managed to get things done just by being herself and without really pissing anyone off. I've listened to recording after recording of her and video after video of her. She was always articulate. She worked for many years saying, you're absolutely wrong. You're wrong what you think about queer people. We're not like what you think. We are the ones who should be telling you what we're like, and not doctors, not psychiatrists. And she did it in a way that was loving and supportive. I just had so much admiration for her. On top of that, because she was so active in the movement early, 60s, way before Stonewall, I know that she and Taylor Husin, after Stonewall, felt pushed aside.
Mm-hmm.
And they could have easily just disappeared, and they didn't. They worked hard to stay in the movement and to stay current with things. And both of them did things that were important. Barbara was vital in having homosexuality removed from the American Psychiatric Manual of Mental Illnesses. And this was 1972 and 1973, long after Stonewall. I know that Kay and Barbara managed to turn around their image. They would often show up at LGBT rallies carrying little plush dinosaurs.
That's such a beautiful memory. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for taking the time today to talking to me for QT. And
it's good to see you, Andreas.
Good to see you too. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. Now, if you would like to learn more about Philadelphia's LGBTQIA+ history, visit the archives of the William Way Center virtually, or stay tuned for queer history events on their website and on social media. And you can make use of the Special Collection Research Center right here at Temple University and read some of the old issues of news publications such as Philadelphia Gay News or The Letter. Whatever you do, make sure you preserve your history and our history for generations to come. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for watching, and see you next time on QT.